Hello, this is George from George's Music Blog, and today I am talking about old school jungle breaks, experimental synth performances, deep house, acid house, chamber music, and much more besides. Yes, these are some of my favourite releases of 2026 so far, following part 1 to this video, which is linked below as well if you'd like to check that out. Now, quick disclaimer, I am not going to be talking about Boards of Canada. Obviously, that is one of my favourite albums of the year so far, but I covered it at length in another video, again linked below, and I'm sure I will feature it again if I do some kind of end of year roundup. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get into it. Xylitol, Blumenfantasie. Here's one of those occasions where I discover an artist and I wonder how I'd not come across her music before. Xylitol is the alias of Catherine Backhouse, producer, DJ and host of a radio show, Slav to the Rhythm, which focuses on vintage Central and Eastern European pop and electronica. And according to the Planet Mu website, she is also co-writing a book on Yugoslavian pop culture. So, a true polymath and scholar of music. Blumenfantasie is her second album on Planet Mu, picking up where Anemones left off a couple of years ago, which I can recommend just as highly as this one. Her influences are reported to be cosmic music, along with hardcore and jungle, and it is very much the latter that seem to come through in the Xylitol sound. So Blumenfantasie is 10 tracks and a punchy 45 minutes of classic jungle breaks and dreamy, spacey melodies, kind of in the mode of what I would think of as classic brain dance from that late 90s era when everyone was cutting up breaks, but with the aim of making cerebral headphone tunes rather than pure dance floor fodder. Not that you couldn't dance to this, you very much could, as Xylitol stays true to the spirit of jungle on most of these tracks, never sacrificing groove and rhythm in the service of technical geekery. And indeed, the production has a very pleasing lo-fi DIY feel to it, which is all 100% of her artistry, I've no doubt, and occasionally the layers of breaks threaten to tumble down as the rhythm almost trips itself up. Really lovely stuff if you're into old school breaks and a more kind of progressive end of jungle. This and Anemones, which came out in 2023, is just as good. Actress and Suzanne Ciani, Concrete Waves. Concrete Waves is a double album consisting of recordings of 2 live performances, one in London and one in Barcelona by Actress, the experimental electronic artist known for his deconstructions and abstractions of club genres, and Suzanne Ciani, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, who I have to admit was not familiar to me, but was born in the 1940s and is a pioneer of electronic music and in particular the synthesizer. Now, Actress is one of my favourite producers of the last decade and quite a lot more. It's probably fair to describe him as enigmatic, certainly his music anyway, which resists easy description. It encompasses structures and tropes from techno, house, UK garage, etc. But the result is heavily textural, very atmospheric. His approach can be extremely minimal at times. Pieces will often be driven by a very sparse melody or a simple effect, but there's something just deeply compelling in the mood it creates. A very idiosyncratic sound all round. I can't speak for Suzanne Ciani's discography, but a quick skim of her Wikipedia suggests a huge body of work spanning film and computer game soundtracks, electronic and new age music and synthesizers. She even worked building Buchla synthesizers and seemingly faced a never-ending mountain of sexism as a solo female electronic artist. Anyway, as a rule, I'm not usually into live albums, but given the experimental and improvisational nature of this performance, you could listen to it and not be aware it was taken from an actual concert. There's certainly no crowd noise. Having said that, there is maybe something lost by not experiencing this in the original setting, with the benefit of the full sound system and obviously the physical environment, which in the case of the London gig was the Barbican Centre. It's obviously quite a unique setting. But in a home listening context, Concrete Waves can feel a little insubstantial at times. It meanders and wanders at the will of the 2 performers, and although it is divided into separate tracks, I'm never aware really when one track ends and another begins. Actress does have a knack, and again, I can only speak for Actress as I'm familiar with his music, a knack for creating music that seems to exist at an almost subconscious level. His 2024 album Static was a prime example of this. This was a record I could play through and be almost unaware of, but which would seem to enter my consciousness at a deeper level. But occasionally Concrete Waves manages to be less than some of its parts, whereby it fades merely into decorative background music where you're really missing being able to watch two performers to focus on and hold your attention. Weirdly, there is one section that makes you sit up and listen, tracks A3 and A4, where a really heavy kick drum is introduced, presumably by Actress, that really dominates the mix and, to be honest, is more jarring than anything else. Other than that, the vibe is very consistent throughout, twinkling, whispering synth notes and layers of atmosphere that chug along on a steady rhythmic pulse. Again, it's largely opaque to me which elements are contributed by each performer, but they certainly seem to complement one another, and this album lives in the same crepuscular world as recent Actress output. I do tend to take something of a wholesale approach to his music anyway, rather than conceiving of it as separate tracks. I pretty much just approach it all as Actress product. And this is more of the same high quality stuff, obviously with added input from one of the originators of electronic music. Squarepusher, Kammerkonzert. Now, I covered Kammerkonzert at length in a separate video, linked below of course, so I will just mention it briefly here. I was slightly taken by surprise with the return of Tom Jenkinson. It hadn't seemed long to me since 2024's Dustro time, but then not everyone on Warp takes 13 years to make an album. Kammerkonzert could be thought of as Squarepusher's take on chamber music, and he has outdone himself once again in terms of recording an album that sounds like no one else but him, and yet sounds different from anything else he's done before. It is a deeply technical and knotty record, consisting predominantly of organic instruments, drums, guitar, bass, strings, various wind instruments, arranged in complex compositions that draw heavily from Frank Zappa, avant-garde jazz, and film soundtracks. Now, Squarepusher is one of my all-time favourite artists, but this is not my favourite mode for him. However, I do find it impossible not to admire the Kammerkonzert project, and it did enamour itself to me with repeated listens. The detail, the execution, and the sheer musicianship are just insane, even if several of the tracks are somewhat overwhelming to listen to. This is definitely not a record to stick on if you're planning to concentrate on something else, although to be fair, you could say that for most Squarepusher albums. So yeah, I am very glad that Tom Jenkinson is still releasing new music and that his appetite for experimentation and broadening his sound is undiminished, even at this advanced stage of his career. Although Kammerkonzert will probably be one of those records that I return to only occasionally, or whenever I decide to create my own film noir about a giant robot possessed by the spirit of Frank Zappa. Oh yes, and a final nugget that was shared on social media recently. If you're wondering where the track titles for Kammerkonzert came from, it's the old telephone directory for London. Jenkinson bought his first 303 from an ad in a magazine called Loot, and he made an assumption about the seller's location based on the area code of the telephone number, which he then rang repeatedly to block any other callers and secure the purchase. Luckily for electronic music lovers, he was successful, and in so doing, took this photo from the inside of the old phone box near the tube station he was calling from. Octo Octa, Sigils for Survival. The release of Sigils for Survival marks a decade since Octo Octa, real name Maya Baldry Morrison, came out publicly as transgender. In her own words, it's a milestone for this past decade of joy and sorrow, and my attempt to encapsulate the intentions and techniques that I used to move through life into a spell. The autobiographical nature of Octo Octa's music becomes clear when considering the evolution of her discography over the last 10 years. From 2012's Between Two Selves, a record of moody deep house shot through with pensive uncertainty, to 2017's Where Are We Going, which offered a more uplifting aspect but was still some way from carefree abandon. That came on 2019's Resident Body, which incorporated breakbeats into Octa's sound along with a looseness and physicality not really present on previous albums, suggesting an artist more comfortable in themselves. Given the dark forces that seem to have been coalescing against the LGBTQ community in recent times, one might expect Sigils for Survival to portray a pessimistic mood, but If anything, it's Octa's most overtly hedonistic and relaxed record yet, a defiant celebration of the unifying and liberating power of dance music, setting the tone for the record and the mindset that it embodies. Right intention, right here, right now, leads with the iconic siren call known by ravers the world over, the Roland TB 303. The pulsing acid riff drives the energy of the track and situates us squarely in rave music's 90s heyday. Some of the slogans from that era have lost their potency in recent times, ending up as hollow cliches through overuse, but by repurposing them as her sigils, Octa imbues new urgency into phrases like keep pressing on and just listen. The tracks bearing those titles are fairly standard fodder, really. Keep Pressing On is a groovy house jam with breakbeats, soulful piano and a funky bass hook that hits in all the right places. Just Listen draws from the bleak techno sound of early UK rave, with raw, pulsing bloops, sirens and Roland drum machines united in riotous clamour to drive the energy. The fact that Sigils sounds like something of a rave time capsule is due in large part to the fact that it was recorded on old school hardware and thus captures the instinctive feel of live performance. This approach is most fully realised on Rituals to Exist and Connect, a mini epic in the mould of early 90s innovators such as Future Sound of London, The Black Dog, The Orb, etc., who elevated the sounds of rave away from the dance floor and into a more cosmic and cerebral realm. Beginning with a back and forth breakbeat and chiming hand pan, it builds to a psychedelic climax furnished by whirring arpeggios and some deftly placed samples. The obligatory Take Me Up, and of course, buried deep in the mix, the classic This Is a Journey into Sound, first deployed by Cold Cut on their remix of Eric B and Rakim, and since plundered by countless beatheads, remixers and DJs. It situates the track on dance music's glorious, never-ending continuum, the journey that started way back and is still going strong. The Black Dog, Loud Ambient 2. Okay, so this is the first Black Dog album to have been released since the death at the end of last year of founding member, and indeed the only remaining member from the original lineup, Ken Downey, which means the Black Dog now consists of Martin and Richard Dust, who have been part of the group since it entered into this incarnation in the early noughties. Now, I don't know if all the tracks on Loud Ambient 2 were recorded without Ken, or for that matter how much of Loud Ambient 1 was. Both records mark a departure in sound from their recent era, which had become very sombre and foreboding, much more in line with their brutal ambient ethos. Loud Ambient takes inspiration from the visual art of Mark Rothko, as well as apparently Joseph Albers, whose work also deals in large squares of bright colour. So both the Loud Ambients are, well, louder and prouder, more confident sounding, I'm almost tempted to say brash, if that can be meant in a positive way, than other recent records, with a more direct techno feel and a focus on big, bold melodies. Don't be misled by the reference to ambient. I actually took a little while to warm to this one, but having spent a bit of time with it, it actually takes me back to classic Black Dog circa kind of Further Vexations, kind of classic era of Black Dog 2.0, with their initial classic era being the early 90s, of course. So we've got the pleasing pulse of industrial techno kick drums and big, bright metallic melodies in super clean, tight production. I'd love to hear some of these on a big sound system. The first Loud Ambient was certainly a fitting swan song for Ken Downey. I don't know if Loud Ambient 2 is a postscript or the start of a new chapter. That remains to be seen. The brothers Dust certainly seem to be highly prolific, so I doubt it's the last we've heard from them. 808 State versus Humanoid, Latent Language. Now this is an EP rather than an album, and a turn up for the books, or a turn up for my books anyway, a collaboration between two names that will hold legendary status for anyone into old school rave. Humanoid is Brian Dugan's one half of Future Sound of London, and responsible for the seminal acid banger Stacker Humanoid, which was released in 1988, incredibly. Still holds up if you listen to it now, an absolute tune and hugely influential, though of course very different from the vast majority of what Duggins would go on to do as part of the Future Sound of London. 808 State were of course fellow pioneers in the UK's acid house explosion of the late 80s and early 90s, with many iconic tunes under their belts. In place of language, brings together Dugan's and Graham Massey, one of the original members of 808 State, for a 4-track EP that draws heavily from the classic sound of their early 90s heyday. Lead track, Optica, is a breaky, psychedelic banger with a trippy kind of Eastern flavour to it, full of pulsing bass, swaggering beats and shimmering textures. Raid is the cut that sounds most like 808 State, with a flickering 303 line, chattering rolling drum machines and a manic energy. It has this kind of deranged breakdown in the middle that reminds me of some other early 808 State tracks, with this really kind of obnoxious sort of electric guitar effect and punk energy. Excellent stuff. The EP closes out with Ruby Chan, which sounds much more like a Dugan's production, much more chilled and expansive, with a wonky sort of swing to it, psychedelic, and with kind of trumpets or maybe a sax too, percolating through the mix. Lovely stuff. Decent little EP if you fancy some acid-drenched bangers. Very old school minded, but bang up to date production wise from two legends of the scene. Carl Craig, Meditations. Carl Craig needs no introduction, but I'll give him a short one anyway. Detroit techno pioneer and legend, he rose to prominence as part of the second wave of Detroit techno in the early 1990s, and perhaps more than any other artist in that scene has done more to situate techno on the broader musical, cultural and psychological continuum. Craig's productions often lean much more into the soulful, the expansive and cinematic side of things. Many of his early records are considered seminal in the lineage of Detroit techno and electronic music in general. In particular, Land Cruising, More Songs About Food and Revolutionary Art, and Elements, which was released under his Psych alias. I'm not familiar with his full discography, but I do hold him in the kind of regard where I will definitely check out anything new he's putting out. However, I quickly discovered that Meditations is not strictly a new release. These pieces were in fact first included on the Masterpiece compilation in 2013, but I believe it's the first time these tracks have been available digitally. Now, rather than the techno for which he is usually known, but perhaps unsurprising given the title, Meditations is in fact a collection of meditative, experimental, almost ambient, synth-driven excursions. I don't know if it was originally Carl Craig who said it, or if it's just one of those cliches that gets thrown around, that the project of techno can be essentially reduced to an attempt to create an alternative soundtrack to the movie Blade Runner. Either way, that certainly feels like the territory for this release. These pieces, and they definitely are pieces rather than tracks, are moody, atmospheric, and very strongly evocative of a nocturnal scene. I'm sensing strong kind of 80s film soundtrack influences here, stuff like John Carpenter. And while Carl Craig is a deeply skilled producer and adept at getting some delightful sounds from his synthesizers, at nearly an hour long, this soundtrack without a film does lag a little bit, to the point where even Carl Craig seems to lose interest with the droning final piece, Meditation 6, which descends into a low hum, the kind of noise that makes you go back to the speakers to see if a connection has come loose a few minutes into its length, which then continues for another 6 kind of pointless minutes. Putting that aside, Meditation 1 is gloriously atmospheric, an elegantly poised exercise in tension and economy, and it raises the bar high for the rest of the record. Meditation 2 does attempt the same feat with more billowy synth washes, but the languid tempo drags its feet a little too much over the course of 10 minutes. Meditation 3, again, would be ideal to accompany a movie sequence, but feels a bit orphaned without any visuals, and the tense mood overstays its welcome somewhat. Meditation 4 rescues things, and the sense of grandeur and drawn-out climax feels much more like Craig's home turf, and Meditation 5 introduces some nice jazzy drum fills. So, if you're a fan of vintage synths and moody film noir soundtracks, then this would be right up your street. And while the whole album feels overly drawn out, there's no question of it in any way diminishing Carl Craig's legend status. Missed Fingers, Leave Your Mind. Moving on to another of the original innovators of electronic music, Mr. Fingers is the alias of house music legend and pioneer Larry Heard. My familiarity with his discography extends as far as one of his mid-90s deep house albums, Sceneries Not Songs, which was released as Larry Heard, and of course the legendary vocal house anthem Can You Feel It, released by his band, Fingers Inc. That one came out in 1986, staggeringly. It does sound old now, obviously, but still an absolute tune. The atmosphere of lazy euphoria they created with a simple synth line, bass, and drum machine is unmatched, really. Anthem. Anyway, to be honest, I had no idea Mr. Hurd was still regularly recording and releasing music, especially under this alias, but I take the view it's always worth checking out new material from such a revered artist. So going into this with some broad expectations, shaped by his deep house stuff, I was kind of surprised by Plastic Nightmares, the opening track, which bursts out of the gate with pulsing, squelchy acid synths and robotic sound effects. It's got quite a serious cosmic disco vibe going on. You can definitely picture this being performed live by a band all dressed up as space aliens or shiny androids or something. The title track, Leave Your Mind, I'm not sure what the significance of the mangled spelling is, to be honest, is another spacey house banger. There's a kind of horn sound that drives the energy of the track, repeating pretty much throughout, oscillating synth arpeggios, and the voice buried deep in the mix, urging you to leave your mind. It's psychedelic, soulful, funky, lovely stuff. Following that, Larry takes things down a notch with The Happening Thing, which takes us much deeper into deep house territory. Lovely, groovy slow burner, and for the rest of the album, seems to let his instincts guide him. Journeying deeper into the substrata of house music, such as the aptly named Tension, riding the pulse of acid house energy on Menagerie, and back down to earth with plenty of lush, soulful jams, two of which feature Brianna Liz Leverett on vocals. I understand Larry Hurd sometimes sings on his own tracks as well, so I'm not sure if he also provides some backing vocals, but either way, these pieces in particular are so warm and the production is just so welcoming. It's a record that really looks after you, if you know what I mean. Great to hear one of the originators still releasing fresh sounds and proof that he is an absolute master of creating the perfect atmosphere. Do check it out. Okay, there we have it. 8 releases from 2026 that I have found to be excellent. Have you listened to any of these? What do you think? What are your favourites that I've missed? What's coming up that I should look out for? Please let me know in the comments. Or are you just going to listen to Boards of Canada for the rest of the year? That is fine too. Okay, that's it from me. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.